announced that they were going to have this 35 building, 25,000 resident complex in April 1943. By May, they made it very clear that they would not rent to black tenants. And almost immediately, there was outrage.
Adam Thornburg wrote the play Stuyvesant Town, This Is Your Home, based on the actual brochure put out by the company that built Stuytown. The complex was intended to house families of soldiers returning from World War II, but as it turned out, only white soldiers.
This was hideous, and back in the day, citizens understood this.
They formed the Committee to End Discrimination in Stuyvesant Town. Those are the committee's organizers, and right there at the center, a dad and his 6-year-old daughter.
I mean, I knew why I was there, and I knew what was happening.
Liz's parents were two of the leaders of that anti-discrimination movement. Years later, her daughter Amy remembers the stories her grandparents told.
They would say things like, I didn't go overseas to fight fascism to come back and have it in my backyard.
The Lorch family also fought hard to integrate the housing complex. They let the Hendrickses, a black family, stay at their apartment after Lee Lorch got a teaching position at Penn State.
What we did was invite the same black couple to stay in our apartment.
They said, you either give up the apartment or you're fired.
Alice Lorch Bartels points out her family paid a heavy price for their activism. Her father was fired from his positions as a math professor at both City College and Penn State.
This became a front page story in the New York Times.
Professor Lorch resisted, and it drew so much attention, another mathematician, Albert Einstein, wrote a letter of support. It didn't save Lorch's job at Penn State or at 2 historically black colleges where he taught after that. He ultimately had to leave this country to get work in Canada.
What do? Do you sell your honor, or do you lose your job? And so that was what he did.
Greg Young from the Bowery Boys podcast explains how MetLife's chairman, Frederick Ecker, justified excluding blacks from Stuytown.
Come out and say, well, okay, you know what? We're going to build a separate housing development, and that can be for African-American residents. And that was the Riverton.
The Riverton, 115 blocks north in Harlem. The black writer and public intellectual James Baldwin wrote about Riverton, quote, "The people in Harlem know they are living there because white people do not think they are good enough to live anywhere else."
So instead of building a sprawling complex like they had for Stuyvesant Town in Parkchester, they built this.
Roger Paris's family were some of the earliest tenants in Riverton, which was 7 buildings housing only about 4,400 people, almost all black.
Somebody once asked me, well, did your parents ever apply for Stuyvesant Town? I'm glad they didn't, because me growing up in Harlem, I wouldn't be who I am now.
Riverton ended up attracting some of the biggest names of black culture, like jazz legend Billy Taylor and the families of Suzanne DePass, who became president of Motown, and Clifford Alexander, the first black secretary of the U.S. Army, and many other prominent figures. However,
But that is just basically creating that kind of Southern separate but equal here in New York.
so Stuytown's white tenants kept fighting.
This is a framed copy of the eviction notice. So anybody walking into the apartment saw that the minute that they walked in.
Liz Fox's family kept the notice and kept their apartment through a compromise. Property owner MetLife ended up allowing the Hendrickses and 2 other black families to move in after 9 years of protests. But the Lorch family was told not to return.
I agree with my parents. I think they did the right thing.
It laid the groundwork for the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which made housing discrimination a federal crime. MetLife ended up selling Stuytown in 2006, which changed the apartments from rent regulated to market rate.
I have several friends who live there and moved in, are paying like the high rent and had no idea about this history at all.
This is what almost everybody there thought should happen, is that this place should not be a segregated housing place. It should be open.
Even though MetLife created a separate but arguably unequal community called Riverton in Harlem for African Americans, that community ended up in many ways becoming a formidable place for young people of color to grow up. That's a fascinating story in itself that we will tell in our next installment in the Created Equal series tomorrow.